Great. Okay, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We have 3 commissioners here at the moment. A fourth one, Maria Miller, will be joining us very shortly. She's just on her way from Parliament. So this is part of Bright Blue's Conservatism and Human Rights project, which is a year-long inquiry. And we're doing several things, including this oral evidence session day, but also some site visits and some written evidence. And then we'll be compiling a report from the commissioners that will be released in mid-2017. So this is very much part of it. We are tackling several themes which we've been looking at today. So that's ranging from how we might tackle discrimination in all of its varieties, how we might enhance human rights abroad and what the role of the British government and Foreign Office in particular is in that. And then thirdly and finally, looking at the future of the Human Rights Act and the British Bill of Rights. So this session is looking at freedom of religion and belief, both here in the UK and abroad. Just to say that you are being filmed and some of your comments will be tweeted, and the comments here today will be transcribed and produced as an annex in the final report. But just to say, we'll make it clear that you are obviously independent and don't necessarily endorse our report's findings, that you're acting as people giving evidence. So if I could ask just ask you to introduce yourselves just to begin with. So Gillian.
Gillian, Merron, Chief Executive Board of Deputies of British Jews.
Miqdaad, Versi, Assistant Secretary General, the Muslim Council of Britain.
Nigel, Chief Executive of the Blair Faith Foundation.
Director of Amnesty International.
Great, thank you very much. If my first question, if I could start, is around religious tension abroad.
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
You had asked us if we would do a few minutes on our organisation. Do you not require that?
We can go into that. What I'll do is I'll ask a question to begin with, and then if you want to talk about your organisation in that, then that's fine. What we've had to do is just reduce the amount of introductory remarks because we found that it's going on quite long, and commissioners are keen to go into it. No, of course, no. But if you'd like to talk about your organisation and have it on record, then please do within the answers.
Could I check too? Because I thought we were covering Human Rights Act and foreign policy as well.
No, the session is predominantly about freedom of religion and belief, both in the UK and abroad, and that was given to you in the invite.
The letter I had talked about all 3, about Human Rights Act.
Right. Okay. Well, we can certainly touch on that, but the session in all of the invites specifically mentioned that. But please feel free to roam wider than that if you would like. On this sort of religious tension abroad, particularly looking at issues within Syria and the Middle East, I want to know really whether we're going through a period of heightened tension between different religious groups overseas, or we're looking at a general reduction with the media magnifying particular conflicts which are emerging. So perhaps I could start with Kate on that issue.
So you want to think about whether what is happening in Syria is about religious tensions?
I'm asking, just generally, internationally, are we seeing a rise in tensions between different religious groups and discrimination towards particular religious groups? Or are we seeing a general decline with only some of these tensions, for example in Syria, just being magnified by the media?
Okay. So I think from an Amnesty International perspective, our research wouldn't allow me to say either of those things. We've definitely, and we have specific research around particular areas of the world, Pakistan, Myanmar, China, other areas where we have looked at where religious discrimination is taking place. But I'm certainly not in a position to talk more broadly about the tensions between religions and the contribution of that to particular areas of the world that you were talking about.
So particularly thinking about those areas that you've highlighted, what sort of areas of the regions of the world and particular issues are worrying Amnesty at the moment?
Well, we stand up against any discrimination and any ways in which people's freedom to follow their religion is persecuted. So whether that is the Falun Gong within China, or it's Christians in Pakistan, or Muslims in Myanmar. We document what is happening, we produce reports, we make representations to governments and to the international community. So those are our more recent work in those particular areas, and in those places, people are not able, with freedom, to follow their own religions, and that is something that we very much would campaign to stop.
And the focus, the areas that you focused on, is there a kind of list, as it were, of the hotspots which you feel deserve more attention, or how are they chosen, as it were?
We haven't looked. We haven't chosen our parts of the world and our focus of research through an overall global lens of religious discrimination. So I say that. So then it is in particular parts of the world where we feel that there is something in particular happening and some work that we could particularly do, which is where those three areas come into play.
And Angela, what's your, are there particular areas of the world that you're particularly worried about at the moment, and what are the sort of chief issues there?
The focus of the foundation is around Islamist extremism, and we're particularly focusing on that because we see a rise in the nature of the challenge and the threat, but we don't just focus on Islamist extremism. Like Amnesty and Kate has just mentioned, for example, we've reported on Myanmar, for example. But for us, the nature of the problem is global. And is rising, and we see obviously examples that you can see the Middle East, the West, but a global threat of extremist ideology is where we focus.
And do you think the action of the UK and other, I suppose, members of the West is helping to improve the situation in terms of reducing the amount of Islamic extremism, or is it making it worse and sort of increasing it?
I think what we're trying to focus on is the nature of the problem. So we see a number of symptoms from extremist ideology, and they are particularly addressed by the UK and other governments in terms of security measures. But we think that unless you understand the nature of the problem of extremism and that it's ideological in nature, all that you're actually doing is treating the symptoms rather than the cause of the problem. So most of our work is around understanding the nature of religious extremism and then coming up with practical solutions in order to counter it.
Thank you. If I could come to you, Miqdaad, and just on this issue around Islamic extremism, and this is where this session is going to touch both domestically and internationally. That threat, how bad is it for Muslims in particular? So obviously we talk about the threat to Britain and other nations, but particularly Muslims within Britain. Is that led to increased Islamophobia, increased stigma, increased discrimination against Muslims?
Thank you very much. So obviously, as the Muslim Council of Britain, we're an umbrella body of Muslim organisations, so I'll be speaking on behalf of the affiliates that we represent. And from that lens, I think that many British Muslims are concerned that some of the narrative that has been created about Muslims internationally feeds very much into a perception of who Muslims are here, and that has a real impact on Islamophobia and has been demonstrated to do so through a number of reports and studies. In particular, the media reporting of that plays a major role in that narrative that is created about Muslims generally, which is then imported as British Muslims as well. So yes, the terrorism abroad definitely impacts the perception of Muslims in the UK and has in terms of documentation and research, demonstrably shown and resulted in an increase in Islamophobia here in the UK.
And do you think there is what role do you think the Muslim community has to play in reducing radicalisation and, for example, in the media we've seen a lot of reports of people going over to fight with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. What role do you think the Muslim community should play in that?
So, of course, as with anything else, Muslim communities are on the front line here. It's very often Muslim families who are broken up. When someone goes to Syria, it's Muslim parents who will be very upset when if their children go. And so this is something that affects Muslim communities, very much. And as a result, there already has been a lot of work being done within Muslim communities to try and discourage people from going to Syria. The Muslim Council of Britain, for example, has made many statements to that effect and encouraged Friday sermons to talk about it. Is there a long way to go? I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's lots more that Muslim communities can do and civil society in general can do. I think what we have to recognize, though, is that when the approach that is often taken by the government and by others seems to not engage with those Muslim communities, seems to not understand or acknowledge the concerns or the perception of Muslim communities on the policies that are being given, then that is really problematic in trying to solve a problem that we all agree is something that needs to be solved. And what we want is to have a joined up approach which considers and engages with communities rather than seems to alienate them. And through a number of reports, including most recently the Open Society Justice Initiative report, Eroding Trust, and the Joint Committee of Human Rights, both saying that the government's approach risks being counterproductive and leading to greater alienation, which is problematic. And from our perspective, what we want to do is encourage mosques as much as possible to be part of civil society, be a place for young people, be a place for further development of young people, and the society as a whole, and engage with the wider society. And we're working very hard on that perspective.
So earlier in the day we heard about Prevent. Are you critical of Prevent, that it's not working with the Muslim community?
The Muslim Council of Britain has been public on its concerns about Prevent, and the fact that we support the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, David Anderson, in a few of his positions, in particular his view that there should be an independent review of Prevent. In addition, his view that the government should be engaging with Muslim communities, including the Muslim Council of Britain, and in the fact that we need to have transparency on many of these approaches. Some people argue it's all about perception. In reality, some of the concerns are not real. What we would argue is that those have been documented in many ways, and when we talk about the key concerns about Prevent can be summarized as apparent lacking in an evidence base, conflating religiosity with extremism, being intransparent, and focusing and discriminating against Muslims in particular. And I think that the fourth one is the one that really is the one that needs to be looked at carefully, because when you have something where Muslim communities are not being engaged with in this whole process, and then a policy seems to discriminate against Muslims or focus directly on Muslims, it's problematic. In the last 10 years, many more people have been killed in Northern Ireland due to Northern Ireland-related terrorism than have been killed in the UK, significantly more. Yet the Prevent duty, for example, is not applicable in Northern Ireland. And I've tried to understand this. I've spoken to many people on this, and what we found is the understanding of the Catholic-Protestant divide and the challenges there have meant that people recognize that were a duty in place that if I consider you to be a potential threat, I report you to the Prevent team. If that were in place in schools in Northern Ireland, that would be hugely insensitive and create many problems. It feels sometimes that is not understood within the the rest of the UK context, and that's why Prevent has led to many people within Muslim communities, in particular after it became a statutory duty after the Counterterrorism Security Act in 2015. After that, it has impacted so many more people in a way that is very problematic. And I think the key thing here is it's not just about these odd stories that are in the press, of which there are many. It is also about the fact that sometimes our politicians have been on the front line saying things. For example, Nicky Morgan, who is a former education secretary, when the Educate Against Hate website was launched, she was asked publicly on Channel 4 News. So, the idea of radicalisation is very clear on your website. It doesn't mention faith in that way, it doesn't talk about Muslims specifically. But are you really saying that if someone changes their faith and becomes a member of the Church of England, they should be reported in the same way as if someone becomes a Muslim? Is that a sign of radicalisation? That if someone becomes a member of the Church of England? She said, no, of course not. But when it's a Muslim, that was a sign of radicalisation, and that's problematic. When you have direct access and example where senior members of government are saying things like that, that's a problem. When a former DUP member of Parliament in the Westminster Hall debate, he asked a question. He said something. He spoke to senior people within the government, or so he said, and he said, "Why is the prevent duty not applicable to Northern Ireland?" was his question. And obviously, from the DUP perspective, you can understand where he's coming from. And the response that he got was, "Please don't mention this. It's not about counter terrorism. It's about counter-Islamic. It's not focusing on terrorism. It's focusing on Islam." He got this. The quote is available, and I'm happy to share that with you. This is someone from within the DUP and within government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. I'm just going to come to you, and then I think commissioners will have questions. So, we heard from Simon Johnson earlier, from the chief executive of the Jewish Leadership Council. And he was talking about the rise in anti-Semitism here in the UK. Are you concerned about internationally as well the rise of anti-Semitism? Is that something which is particularly concerning you at the moment?
Simple answer is yes, but let me just tell you the Board of Deputies of British Jews, we represent cross-communally the estimated 300,000 Jews, however they may be, whether very observant or not at all. And those 300,000 represent just 0.5% of the population in Britain, so you get some sense of numbers. But our job is to be the voice of British Jews to government, media, other faith groups, etc., who are seeking to understand our community's concerns and interests. So undoubtedly, anti-Semitism is at the forefront of our minds, unsurprisingly. And I might add, not only our minds, and I think that's important, it isn't just a matter for Jews. I have noticed very much that as anti-Semitism has, particularly in the political sphere, hit centre stage, how those who are not Jewish have wanted to stand up and be counted, if you like, as being actively against anti-Semitism. Is it of concern beyond our borders? Yes, of course. Anti-Semitism across Europe, and sometimes in tragic circumstances, is very much on our minds. We all remember the attacks in Paris. We all remember the ones that followed the security guard who was killed outside a synagogue in Denmark, a volunteer who was just doing his duty, and so on. And we also see a great number, although there's debate about why, but a great number of, for example, French Jews coming to live in Britain, which is a change in the community. Although I emphasise there is a question about why. Some of it is about feeling, but some of it is maybe for economic reasons, which is all fine. We are members of the European Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Congress, both of whom are very active in this area. And I think what I'd say about anti-Semitism is it isn't necessarily that something is enshrined in a law, but it is how people are regarded, how they are treated. And for me, anti-Semitism perhaps is one of the oldest forms of discrimination, hatred, which goes back so many centuries. And we very much look at, and I'm just looking here, at the working definition of anti-Semitism, which I think is important, and you might be interested in your inquiry. But it is a certain perception of Jews expressed as hatred towards Jews, whether that's rhetorical or physical manifestations directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards institutions and religious facilities. And there can be a whole range. It isn't just the crude stereotypes that we're used to. You know, the Jews are running the country, running the media, they're all rich, blah, blah, blah. But it is also, and I hope you'll be looking at this, the way in which the State of Israel is regarded. Criticism of Israeli government policies, that's understood. Israelis criticise Israeli government policies all the time. That is a sign of a healthy democracy. But it is where it is exceptional treatment of Israel that would not be applied to other countries. And I hope very much when you're doing your investigation, as this is something that's come up both in the Home Affairs Select Committee, who did a very good inquiry into anti-Semitism, but it also came up in terms of the Chakrabarti inquiry within the Labour Party and in many other places. I do think that anti-Semitism isn't just about seeing Jews, it's also about the kind of the political space which it may occupy, which is a big question for us in this country, but also beyond.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Maria?
Yes, firstly, can I apologise for my lateness? There is a vagary of whether or not we're going to vote, and I've been let off till 3 o'clock. I just really wanted to touch on something we were talking about earlier, and I hope you haven't covered it already, but it's this balance of religious freedom and other equality strands. And we talked earlier about the Asher Bakery case, and I just wondered whether you could reflect on how you feel the law is working when you start to talk about the protections of religious freedom versus other protections, and I suppose the intersectionality of those, and whether you feel through our inquiry we could be doing more to make that clearer, or is it absolutely fine as it is?
May I? I think I'd say for me it isn't so much about the law, but it's around understanding and education and application. So we, for example, every week we will be contacted by somebody who's having some difficulty in carrying out their practice, maybe on a Friday when it's Shabbat, or for a religious festival, High Holy Day, where they cannot work, for example, or take exams, if they are of that level of observance. And so it isn't that there's a problem with the law, because the law would say you cannot be discriminated against, but when you're in the workplace or in your college or university, you will be in an environment where people don't understand what it means to be an observant Jew. Now, that's the place for us where we think work needs to be done, and rather than just talk about it, just to give you an example, we produced this, which was the Employer's Guide to Judaism, which has helped employees explain to their employer what the issue is, and has enabled employers to understand more about what an observant Jew may need. So what I'm trying to say is that an employer, for example, may not wish to discriminate, but in ignorance may be doing so. And I feel there's a whole area of work around that, and we have tried to make our contribution on that.
I think we take it back into schools as well. So one of the priorities of Amnesty globally is human rights education. And in this country, I think we would like to see greater emphasis on that in the curriculum, because I think that it allows children to explore these issues in an appropriate way at a very young age, understand differences, understand where certain rights are absolute, and where there's a bit of negotiation that is needed, and get used to that. And I think that we don't do nearly enough of that in schools. I think some of the really good work that we've done in Northern Ireland in a post-conflict society has been in schools, and it's been through debating for and others where as you know, the education system is very aligned along religions, where we've brought children from different backgrounds together in ways that they hardly ever meet each other. So I think that there is a lot to be done through human rights education that could just help all our understanding of each other.
support that, really, the foundation does a lot of practical work for us countering religious extremism, and we have an education programme called Generation Global. It's been running as long as the foundation, so we've reached around 200,000 children in about 20 countries of substance, and essentially it's around dialogue and critical thinking, and helping young people understand each other and understanding their faiths and traditions as well, because in our view that's the way you build just and resilient societies, and individuals' personal resilience, which helps combat against the extremist narrative, but are also skills for us all in a modern society around dialogue and critical thinking. And the Foundation's also working on something called the Global Commitment, where we want an initiative of Mr. Blair for governments around the world to sign up to education systems that route prejudice and discrimination from their curricula. There's very disturbing examples around the world of discriminatory material against people who are just different, as well as other faiths and traditions. So we would like to see a commitment by governments, and we can send you more information on this, to curricula that is promoting open-mindedness and respect for difference, and educating about different religious beliefs and traditions.
Oh, sorry, you go first.
I think that the question of intersectionality when it comes to different rights is a very difficult one, especially when it comes to the Baker case that you were talking about earlier. I think that within Muslim communities, because of the priorities, it's not even being thought of or thought through very often, because it feels like the very basic rights are being at threat sometimes, so that some of these threats seem to be a long way away from them. So within Muslim communities, that type of discussion I haven't heard as much of as I would have expected. In particular when it came to the judgment of the Baker case, because it has huge implications in terms of the the rights of religious freedom versus and the concerns about homophobia and the way that it happens, and it's a very difficult discussion. I think that until sort of these basic concerns are sort of understood more, I think really education is the biggest. I agree that education is really the way to get over some of these concerns, and I think that as a whole, Muslim communities are likely to be accepting of some of these judgments if they are done in a way that is fully understood, because the sort of inward-lookingness or the challenges that are being faced are so big in many other areas that this seems to be one which can be understood and explained away, and you can deal with it, if that makes sense.
How can education help though? Because what the law was saying was that somebody's religious belief is not as important as the rights of the LGBT community.
Correct. So what I mean there is by
in the situation where you're providing services as opposed to in a religious context.
And
so that's I mean we're at risk as a society of sending very mixed messages to people, that it's okay if you're in whatever religious institution you go to listen to people preach in a certain way, but when you're in carrying out your work, you cannot follow those religious teachings. That's incredibly complicated for most people.
It is very difficult, and the people who have been discussing this, to be honest, seem to be split down the middle in terms of even within the more liberal reformist type thinking. There's a lot of discussion, and there's no silver bullet. There's no answer that everyone is happy with. People have really struggled with this case in particular, even within the academia and the Muslim academia and other places which have had this discussion, because of the implications of something like this. From the one side, you've got the understanding of absolute freedom of religion, and on the other side, you've got the idea that everyone should be free to, in a public society, to not be discriminated against in terms of service provision. And then the sort of difference. the one thing I'd say is understanding the concern as to the reciprocity element is very important, and that's the argument that's worked quite a lot.
Actually, the risk of incurring the wrath of the chair, it was interesting that the reaction of the previous group was in some way trivialising that case, that it wasn't really as important as all that because there were bigger fish to fry. I mean, I'm particularly interested from, say, for instance, Amnesty's point of view. How would you react to that? Because I can understand that point, that there are bigger problems in the world to be dealing with other than the ability for somebody to be able to write something they want on a cake.
Well, I think, I think that it is really important that people aren't discriminated against in service provision. And, it may be a cake, but it could be all sorts of other things. It could be happening to people in all sorts of areas of their life, every day of their life. And that's the thing that, we have to guard against. So I have no difficulty with that decision of the court on that case, because it would just be so hurtful to be constantly told that you would not have a cake, be able to book a hall, be able to do all sorts of things, and that discrimination to be somehow institutionalised. I think it's also worth remembering that in Northern Ireland, it's the only part of the islands of the UK and Ireland where same-sex marriage is not legal. So, we still have a way to go in terms of discrimination in that part of the world.
Nigel.
I think we've gone quite a long way on this line of questioning, but I'm just interested about this real conflict, that there are certain points of discrimination which take place, and the more extreme examples being overseas, which are driven explicitly by religious belief. So I'm just interested in how you approach that as a human rights issue when you're attempting to protect people's right to freedom of belief, but at the same time there is discrimination which is directly driven by that, and that is a direct conflict which is almost irreconcilable. So when we talk about education and mutual respect and tolerance, there is not that mutual respect because they are absolutes. So I'm just interested in how those two, both in the domestic context, which is where the sort of the cake issue comes in, but probably more dramatically internationally, how do you sort of reconcile those as objectives as an organisation that's seeking to protect human rights in the generality?
So Lynn, not me.
I think both of you, because I'm interested in the work that the foundation does as well. But yeah.
And to Kate, but any religious belief has to, for an individual, has to live within the context of the society that they're in and the law of the society that they're in. So we would obviously defend the right to religious belief, and you can have a religious belief, but if you're then putting yourself in a position when you're contravening the law of the society in which you're living.
But in some countries, the law of the land will
of
be
course.
driven by that.
Yes, sorry, it was more in the context of the West and of Britain. I was answering your question.
So we would tackle the discrimination, however it occurred, whether it was against you in terms of practicing your religion, freedom in terms of your sexuality, whatever the issue was, we would tackle that sense of that issue of discrimination. We would oppose laws that enforce discrimination, and we would try to educate. So I think these things all reinforce each other. There isn't one or the other, and you would use different things in different situations.
Purely in a domestic example, I assume that Miqdaad, you would accept that your comparison of your useful reference to the fact that prevent does not seem to apply to in Ireland and has not been used to survey Irish Catholics relies on the same system of equalities legislation, and or at least you are appealing to the same equalities framework that is at play in the Baker case and will continue to be at the heart of these tensions between freedom of religious expression and equality.
To an extent, I guess. I mean, when it comes to any policy, the general idea of fairness, not favours, and not being treated differently, and double standards between any communities, I think is a principle that should be at the heart of any equalities, anything. Because I think equality and the way that it works should be a core principle. when it comes to this intersectionality, it's a very difficult one. And the one thing I'd say is reciprocity is very important. The idea that, well, I'm happy for this to happen to others, but not for it to happen to myself. And just getting that across, I think, is a very important part of the education process, and getting people to think in that way, because it is very easy to think about yourself. It's very difficult to think about how you might impact other people. And I think that's just the approach I take. But I don't have an answer to the question of the bakery and the cake.
No, but I just noted that you've been very explicitly referencing the language of discrimination when you were talking about prevent as a policy that discriminated against Muslims, and that in itself plays into the broader conversation that we're having here about equalities law and discrimination as a. I'm sure you had another question.
Yeah, well, the question I was going to ask is, the consensus which has seemed to have formed in earlier sessions is that the legislative framework that we have in the UK, the Human Rights Act, for example, is adequate. It's more about the enforcement of it or the interpretation of it. Are we all agreed on that? Or do we think there should be stronger safeguards for particular religious expression here in the UK?
And I think that's what I said earlier, that it for me isn't about the actual nuts and bolts of the legislation, but the practice and as we've all talked about one way or another, the understanding, the education, etc. And I think there's a lot of things that, when I say we, I mean people around these two tables take for granted. I remind myself, for example, we have a whole programme through the Board of Deputies of going into schools all across the UK talking about what it means to be a Jew, and our volunteers or staff or elected representatives are going to schools where people have never knowingly seen someone who is Jewish. Now, that might be remarkable to us, but you move outside of certain areas, in other words, the mass of the country, that's how it is. So I think we do well, and I'm sure you will remember this, to remind ourselves, actually, in lots of ways, we start on quite a low base. So legislatively, we're in quite a high position. But in terms of our understanding, and I'm sure colleagues will understand this, we're somewhat lacking. And that's where that lack of understanding, the day-to-day negative opinions and things that are said and done, that's where it comes. That's one of many places. It comes from pure ignorance. So I think we have a duty to overcome ignorance at minimum. Yes, there are bad people in the world, but there's also a lot of ignorance, not from bad people.
Yes. Any other thoughts around the legislative framework? We're happy with the Human Rights Act, for example, and we think that that's sufficient. We don't think there's anything extra that's needed to protect religious expression through the law.
There's one area which comparatively is small. I think that I'd agree with the principle that as a whole legislatively we're basically there. There is a question of religious discrimination specifically, and I'll have to get back to you with the details of where exactly in the law there is an area to be improved. But in particular, certain communities are considered to be racial groups and therefore protected, and faith groups are slightly outside that framework. And I think that there is a scope to include them within the religious discrimination framework I don't think they're fully yet. But as a whole, I don't think if I was to say the priority, that would not be even close to the priority, given the wealth of other areas which are very important when it comes to implementation, when it comes to the big issue here, which for me is the normalization and the social acceptability of Islamophobia and Antisemitism and many other forms of racism and bigotry, which for me is the biggest concern right now.
But for me, it would be very welcome to move away from the Human Rights Act being a political football continuously, and all the negative stories about it, and for us to actually celebrate the fact that we have a wonderful piece of legislation that we should be proud of, and that is, the fundamentals of our ability to claim our rights, and when we individually end up in potentially can end up in really difficult situations, the Human Rights Act is just the most wonderful piece of legislation. We've launched today some public education work, and we have members of the Hillsborough families talking about the fact that it took them 27 years to get the truth about what happened to their loved ones, and without the Human Rights Act, they would never have got that. And they are so clear and so passionate about that. For me, it's just it's a failure of politicians not to be talking about rights in a uplifting way, but always to be talking about them in a derogatory way, and turning the human rights, trying to turn the Human Rights Act into a political football, and it being about people being allowed to stay in the UK because they've got a cat or whatever else. You know, these things that absolutely have no truth. You know, prisoners allowed to watch pornography. People occupying a building having to be taken Kentucky Fried Chicken because it's their human right. All of those stories that just pollute the debate about human rights and our ability to take that forward consistently and, you know, with integrity. And I think that it would be great to be able to move away from that and get into a positive conversation about how human rights are there for all of us and protect all of us.
So just adding slightly to that is just the idea of legal aid is just a small point, but important to bear in mind when we've got the Human Rights Act and other things. You know, the fact that because of the residence test that's happened more recently, and the fact that certain migrants who've come in are therefore not able to get the same level of legal aid as they were previously. These are things that seem to impact the implementation of many of the rights framework, because they're not able to be implemented because of the lack of legal aid. So there are other areas which perhaps impact, but I fully agree. And you know, the Muslim Council of Britain signed a Human Rights Act pledge to show, you know, our support for the Human Rights Act as something that's really important and something that shows our leadership across the world.
And just finally, around tackling human rights abuses abroad, which is also a major theme of this session. So obviously there's a limit to what the Foreign Office is able to do to fix every, or try and fix every human rights abuses abroad, but they've committed to double the funding through the Magna Carta Fund. Is there anything else which you think the Foreign Office should be doing to help improve human rights abroad?
So I would say yes, and I think the human rights should be a consistent strand through British foreign policy. I think if you think about foreign policy and you think about the drivers of security and prosperity, which the government is very clear about, successive governments have been very clear about, I would like to see a third corner there in a triangle, which is human rights, and the human rights are taken into account as foreign policy is developed. At the moment, it's too often the case that human rights are taken into account where it is easier to do so than in other places. And my absolute current example would be the continuing selling of arms to Saudi Arabia in contravention of the International Arms Trade Treaty, and in the knowledge that those arms are being used in Yemen, where civilians are being targeted in markets, hospitals, schools, mosques, elsewhere. And you know, it is, in our view as Amnesty International, it is the issues, other issues are taking dominance over the human rights issue. In other parts of the world where the government perhaps is less concerned about trade or security, then perhaps human rights would come more to the fore. That's where I think that we have a double standard, and I think it's one that, you know, we will continue to point out from Amnesty.
And Angela, did you, in terms of the work that the Foundation does, is there any more that the Foreign Office can do to support your work, or?
Our perspective on this, the question you asked, and our evidence was particularly around religious radicalisation, so not really comment on that. I think not so much perhaps the Foreign Office, although we do work with some of the agencies of government, for example the British Council. What we think should be incorporated is back to the education point around the skills of dialogue and critical thinking being an important part of everyone's education. So it would be more that rather than on the human rights and the government's attitude.
Any final questions from commissioners?
Yes, I wanted, I'm afraid, sorry Miqdaad, to go back to prevent and just finally ask, do you accept that there are misapprehensions about prevent, and what do you think the Muslim Council of Britain's responsibility is to change those misapprehensions?
Yeah. So first, it's worth noting the Muslim Council of Britain is not a counter-extremism body. It's an affiliate-based body based on our hundreds of affiliates across the country from different backgrounds. And with that in mind, our responsibility is not to be an arm of the government in any respect in this issue. What we want to do is advocate on behalf of these communities and understand what are the key concerns that Muslim communities have, and a safe and secure Britain is one of them. With that background in place, of course, when there are misapprehensions about Prevent out there, and when those are the case, we have on occasion explained those where relevant. So, for example, I've had people come to me and say, you know what, my young child might. I don't want to send my young child to school. I mean, I was at a big, massive event, a few hundred lawyers who were there, Muslim lawyers who were discussing different issues, and I was speaking there. And afterwards, someone came to me and talked to me about their concerns about Prevent. I wasn't even speaking about Prevent. And they were talking about how they felt that their young children might be taken away from them, and how their school, they couldn't even talk about about Egypt. I think it was at the time it was near the sort of President Sisi and Morsi and the challenges there. And they felt they could, they didn't want to speak openly at home because of the risk the child might speak something like that at school. And there were 5 different parents who came to me and talked to me about that. And each one of them said they're going to set up their own school, their own homeschooling they wanted to do, and set up on their street because they had a few people who were interested. One of them was just worried, and the other 2 or 3 were thinking, what can I do? I'm in a big situation, and I think I might want to leave this school and go to another school. And I tried to explain the importance of actually remaining within the system, etc., and how some of these things were overblown in the way that it was portrayed. For example, it was a front page story in I think the Daily Express earlier that week, which is why it brought up. So we definitely when there are situations.
The story about the toddler.
Sorry?
Yes, there was the famous story about the toddler.
Yes, I think that's probably the time it was. And so I think that there are serious issues and concerns with Prevent. They should not be overblown, and care should not be taken in going too far. But at the same time, I think the issue is not about it being overblown. I really think the issue is the other way around. That the concerns are not being taken seriously enough. And the fact that as a whole, the concerns being brought by Muslim communities are not being engaged with by government at all. I think that's a bigger concern than the point you raised.
Okay, thank you. Finally, which is, of what we're trying to do is hoover up ideas which we could recommend in our commission. If there's one thing, I know you've probably got a ton of things, but if there's one thing you'd like to see this commission recommend when we produce our final report, what would that be? So I might ask Kate just to go first.
I think it would be to develop a foreign policy with a consistent approach to human rights and to address this issue of double standards.
Okay, thank you.
Our priorities would be around policy change and education.
Mine would be focused on acknowledging and dealing with the social acceptability of discrimination, and in particular Islamophobia, within the political and media class, and the spread of that hatred which then leads to violence.
Thank you. Gillian?
Promoting education and understanding about what it is to be a Jew, particularly if you're in an area where there are no Jews, and understanding that Jews come in all sorts of different manifestations. There isn't one type. And if you look at, for example, the GCSE religious studies syllabus, we produce the definitive resource to help educators. That's all fine, but what it means is that nobody actually thought about what resources are being put into schools to teach the range of Judaism. So, not a complaint, more of an observation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all four for coming today. Sorry that we kept you waiting a little, but that was incredibly rich and useful for our work. So please keep in touch because we're going in a kind of policy formulation stage, so it'd be good to keep your ideas. But thank you again for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.